Wherever you're listening in the world, it's a pleasure to welcome you to IsraelCast, the podcast powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. I'm Stephen Shalowitz, reminding you that for over 120 years, Jewish National Fund USA has been the premier philanthropic movement for the land and people of Israel. While best known for planting trees in Israel, JNF USA contributes to Israeli life in so many ways, including community development in the Negev and the Galilee, preservation of heritage sites, supporting people with disabilities, connecting high school and college students to Israel, and helping our brothers and sisters in need following the heinous October 7th terrorist attack. To learn more and to see how you can contribute, to visit jnf.org. Once again, jnf.org. Plus, if you haven't done so already, we'd love it if you subscribed, rated, and reviewed us, 5 stars, of course, wherever you get your podcasts. And we'd love it too if you shared the show within your universe. And in just a moment, get a pen and paper handy because I'll be telling you why you need to be in Dallas, Texas from November 14th to the 17th, 2024. So listen out for that. But first, as for this episode, our featured guest is Tal-Or Cohen Montemayor, the founder and executive director of Cyberwell, an international nonprofit organization focused on combating the growing wave of online Jew hatred being spread through social media. The organization uniquely works with leading social media platforms to identify and remove anti-Semitic content. In addition to social media platforms themselves, she's provided analysis and consulting services to the Institute of National Security Studies, Israel's Ministry of Strategic Affairs, and the Jewish Agency. Tal-Or received dual bachelor's degrees in law and government affairs from Reichman University, that's IDC Herzliya, and was admitted into Israel's bar in 2019. She was born and raised in Maryland and emigrated to Israel at 18 as a lone soldier to serve in the Israel Defense Forces. And with that, Tal-Or, it's lovely to have you on the program. And I really want to start out by having you share the mandate of Cyberwell, really share what it's all about and the need that you saw in creating it 2 years ago. And we're talking about before October 7th.
Right. Thanks, Stephen. So Cyberwell is the first ever open database of online anti-Semitism. I should mention we're an international nonprofit based in Israel. And when we launched the first ever open database of online anti-Semitism, our goal was not only to reflect the state of anti-Semitism online with real-time data, but really to create a solution or a resource for the major social media platforms who are platforming online anti-Semitism to better remove that content at scale. So I can talk to you about where I got this idea and why we launched this actually 2 years before October 7th. So when you mentioned I'm a recovering lawyer, and when I left law, I went into the open source intelligence and business intelligence space, and this was actually right after the Tree of Life synagogue shooting. So I think that because of my background as an American at the time, and also because I'm a student as well of history and Jewish history specifically, I was put on a lot of projects that were looking at extremist movements in the United States, hate crimes in the United States, and an anti-Semitism in the darker corners of the internet. And what I really noticed at that time as I led these large-scale research projects was a very clear migration of deeply anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic conspiracy theories from our darker platforms to our mainstream everyday social media platforms. And as a lawyer at the time, I kind of asked myself, what is the difference between a dark platform or a hate channel and a mainstream social media platform? Well, one of the answers is that the mainstream social media platforms actually have digital policies. They have this entire cottage industry called trust and safety, which is the way that they intend to be ethical with the use of their platforms. So I thought, what if we created a solution that was going to wed both the most advanced technology and social listening tools and AI with this added element of digital policy compliance? So that's exactly what we do today. We're monitoring the major social media platforms in both English and in Arabic. And we're giving all of that data over to the social media platforms, not just to alert them that there's anti-Semitic trends, but actually provide them with the solutions on how to better enforce their existing policies.
So there's a lot to unpack there. And I first want to start out by asking you, when you saw all of this hatred coming about, what were the origins of that hatred? Where was it all coming from?
A good question. So there are multiple hate channels and darker platforms, places where extremist organizations will congregate. That's both from the right and from the left, and share this type of anti-Semitic content, deeply hateful content, and even violent content. And the thing is that what we're interested in seeing with the migration of anti-Semitic content is the what we like to call, or what I call, gateway platforms. The most popular gateway platform is actually YouTube, and I would like to explain why I characterize it this way. If you remember during the QAnon conspiracy theory, there was a lot of scapegoating of the platform, and specifically after the January 6th insurrection, there was a lot of scapegoating around Parler, saying that Parler was one of the most extreme platforms. This is where everybody was organizing for the January 6th insurrection. We have to shut down Parler. And Parler was, in fact, deplatformed by the major tech companies. Well, it turns out that in the actual testimony of the January 6th insurrectioners who believed in this QAnon conspiracy theory, the number one platform that they cited as where they got their information from was actually YouTube. And that is very much on purpose. There was somebody who was on 4chan, who was an influencer on YouTube, who actually brought the QAnon conspiracy theory out from the dark platforms and into the mainstream, where it can now reach much wider audiences and actually create a violent movement. And we're seeing the same exact thing today in the abuse of our mainstream social media platforms, including YouTube, including TikTok, where you have extremist groups teaching each other how to open accounts, leverage AI, and actually abuse the large scale audience that the major social media platforms have to make anti-Semitism have a new reach that it never had before. And this is absolutely a phenomenon that was energized by October 7th. It's not only that there was a celebration of the deeply gory and violent anti-Jewish snuff that flooded, right, the social media platforms that was coming from Hamas's terrorist propaganda. It was the fact that it was celebrated both by the radical left and Islamic supporters of Hamas in mainstream online spaces and by the white supremacists as well. There was open discussion that this is the opportune moment to, quote, red pill or wake people up to the Jewish question and the Jewish problem. And this is a phenomenon that we still see today. And if we take it back to the ecosystem of the online space and social media, the social media platforms make up over half of the worldwide internet activity. That means that their audience and their reach is vast, and there is a vested interest for them and increasing pressure for them to more effectively monitor their platforms and enforce against this type of hateful and even pro-terror content.
Yeah, before I ask you exactly how Cyberwell works, it seems that the social media platforms themselves were actually caught off guard too on October 7th. I mean, they failed to enforce their own digital standards and policies, but they too were really attacked. And I'm wondering if you can address that.
Absolutely. What we saw on October 7th was the most successful hijacking of our favorite apps by a terrorist group. And this hijacking was done very purposely by Hamas, not only broadcasting their attacks, sometimes even live streaming the kidnapping and execution of families from their homes directly to their Facebook accounts. So this was a very successful hijacking that actually used the social media platforms as a broadcast system to perpetuate this terrorist attack far beyond the point of time and space of the attack itself. It was a new level of psychological warfare that then was even amplified or celebrated by people who were characterizing this as part of, quote, Palestinian resistance. And I think what people fail to understand is, yes, the social media platforms were absolutely caught off guard. Cyberwell also saw that the level of open anti-Semitism in Arabic specifically was very clear. There was no investment or infrastructure on the part of social media platforms to effectively moderate for that content. But this isn't only an issue of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
This is an issue of national security. Okay, the weekend following October 7th, there was a jihadi group that slaughtered some 800 Christians in Africa, and they too used Facebook to upload their attack. because they were learning from Hamas. And this is true of terrorist groups. They learn from each other. Here we are after 1 year after the October 7th attacks. And as also an American citizen, I'm kind of waiting for our airport security moment, right? Today, you can't walk through an airport after 9/11 without taking off your shoes and removing all your liquids in a bag. Well, what are we doing with the social media platforms? Why isn't there a serious inquiry into the lessons that they have learned on October 7th when they were successfully hijacked by a terrorist group? It's a matter of national security. It's a matter of all of our personal safety, and it's something we need to get answers for.
Yeah, well, what are they doing and how have they addressed it since October 7th?
The way that social media platforms have dealt with the flood of online anti-Semitism is very reactionary. They set up quote unquote war rooms or situation rooms where they had dedicated people who were focused on the issue of removing this violent content and also some of the flooding of the anti-Semitic content. Cyberwell, this was very much our kind of time to shine as first responders on the digital front lines, because that's exactly what we were set up to do, was to be able to provide clear data and analysis on where are the weak points, where are the policies failing to be enforced, what type of tweaks can we do to the algorithms or the classifiers that are meant to remove this content at scale to effectively get this content off. But we have a long-term problem here, right? Online anti-Semitism was being removed by social media platforms only about 30% of the time at best on
You're
average.
talking
That
about
was prior
before October
to
7th.
October 7th, right?
Okay.
So the state of online anti-Semitism prior to October 7th was already very bad and increasingly worse. And in fact, most Jews had reported, especially young Jews and Jews in the European communities, that online anti-Semitism was the number one form of anti-Semitism that was affecting them on a day-to-day basis. Okay, which makes sense because we're all on these platforms about 2 hours a day minimum. And if you're a young teenager, maybe 4 and 5 hours a day. Okay, so this is a deep way that we interact with the world. It's the anti-Semitism that would affect us on a day-to-day basis. According to AJC's 2023 study, by 2023, the majority of American Jews who experienced online anti-Semitism, 1 in 3 of them would actually take active steps to then hide their identity, either offline or online. So the state of online anti-Semitism was already bad and getting worse prior to October 7th. October 7th was an online hijacking of our favorite apps by a Hamas terrorist group, and that just ensued a flooding of the digital space with deeply anti-Jewish content.
And so talk a little bit then about how Cyberwell actually works. Sort of for from a technical perspective, but make it in layman's terms for those of us that aren't very tech savvy.
Cyberwell is monitoring the major social media platforms with a set of social listening tools or open source intelligence tools and AI to identify content that's highly likely to be anti-Semitic.
And how do you define highly likely to be anti-Semitic?
Well, the way that we do our analysis, and I'll just say first we collect the data and then we are vetting it with human beings, with analysts here at Cyberwell. And our definition that we use to lean on is the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, or the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. That is the consensus definition of anti-Semitism that's been adopted by close to 40 countries at this point and well over 1,000 universities and sports leagues and municipalities. That definition of anti-Semitism has 11 examples of what is anti-Semitism. So we analyze it according to the IHRA definition, and then we add another layer of analysis, which is how does this violate the policies of the platforms themselves? So we're really looking at this from a compliance perspective. I'm a platform, I have a policy, I'm interested in enforcing that, and all of the analysis and data that we give to the social media platforms, if that's a recommendation to improve their policy, if that's a specific way to enforce their policy or remove a specific anti-Semitic trend at scale, is actually really rooted in providing a pro bono service to them.
Can you talk then about the evolution of online anti-Semitism study pre and post October 7th that Cyberwell initiated, created, because the findings, I had a look at it and the findings were absolutely fascinating. I'd love you to do a little bit of a deep dive for our listeners, Tal-Or, about some of the narratives that you've seen that have changed pre and post October 7th, and also to give our listeners a sense of the numbers in the growth in this online hatred.
Sure. So Cyberwell just released a new report looking at the way that online anti-Semitism has evolved or shifted following the October 7th attack. So let's take it back from the beginning. October 7th, so Hamas is flooding the online space with this violent anti-Jewish content, which then triggers celebratory and similarly deeply anti-Semitic content. Cyberwell tracked in the first 3 weeks following the October 7th attack an 86% increase in online anti-Semitism, so nearly a doubling of the rates that we were seeing. And this time, the nature of the online anti-Semitism was decidedly more violent. In the Arabic data set specifically, meaning Arabic content that was anti-Semitic, 61% of that data was actually calling for violence against Jewish people, up to and including calling young Muslim men to come over into Israel, take up arms, and kill as many Jews as they can. So this is a departure from what we were seeing prior to October 7th, where the majority of the content that we were seeing was what we call classic anti-Semitism that's rooted in disdain, tropes about Jewish power, tropes about Jewish greed, even pedophilia, those types of characteristics, negative characteristics, and stereotypes about Jews now has shifted to being overtly more violent. And if we look at the narratives of this specific data, we are now seeing that the number one narratives online are that Jews are the enemy and that Jews are evil. And this is something that gives me a lot of pause and a lot of concern, because we've moved past anti-Semitic jokes, tropes, conspiracy theories, power manipulation, and now we're really, in the psychological term, it's in-group, out-group. We're completely dehumanizing the Jewish people. They are the enemy. They are evil. And this is the type of psychological priming of anti-Jewish hostility that you saw during the Third Reich too. It was a progression, right?
Yeah, and if I can interrupt you right there, because I'm looking at the study right now, 29.2% Jews are an enemy. That's what you're seeing online right now. 29 point, so it's like 30%. It's like a third of the content that's out there is talking about Jews as the enemy.
Right. And before October 7th, it was more Jews control the world. It's a conspiracy theory. It's something that's
Yeah.
beyond me. It's not something that I would necessarily have control of. It's just like you're saying, oh, the banks, oh, the media. It doesn't seem very personal. Now you're saying Jews are the enemy. Jews are evil. That's the second most popular narrative at 21%, right? That means that if you meet a Jew, what are you supposed to do if they're the enemy or evil? You're supposed to act on it. And the
Mhm.
second thing that we saw, which was a major characteristic of online anti-Semitism post October 7th, was the proliferation of the October 7th denial campaign.
Yeah.
So there was the hijacking of the platforms with the October 7th attack itself. And then as early as October 8th, Cyberwell released actually two deep dives looking at the October 7th denial campaign that started online that reached a tremendous amount of traction. We looked at a verified data set of only 300 examples over the course of a month that reached 25 million people. And the October 7th denial campaign, which we can get into, is a modern form of Holocaust denial. It brings the believer of this conspiracy theory through every station of anti-Semitic thought, but how that translated in terms of the way that Westerners are also perceiving the conflict is actually pouring fuel on the fire and the tension and really bringing them to target now the Jewish community because they believe that this entire thing was a hoax. It was set up, and therefore the
Mhm.
defensive war that Israel is managing right now is unjustified, right?
Yeah, I'm sure we're going to get back to that study, but another report that Cyberwell released ahead of International Women's Day this past March 2024, exposing the rape denial narrative on social media. And I'd love you to highlight that because that to me is just really vile.
It's very vile. So when we look at the October 7th denial campaign, which again started as early as October 8th, there were three primary narratives at the time. In the first 3 months post October 7th, about 39% of October 7th denial material was content that was denying that rape or sexual violence ever occurred, followed by the accusation that Israel actually orchestrated the attack, and finally, the accusation that Israel orchestrated the attack because they're profiting from it. When you look at the sexual violence and the rape denial that happened in the October 7th denial, I mean, this is really a double-edged sword because it's not only deeply anti-Semitic to deny the victimhood of Jewish women who were raped and sexually assaulted on October 7th, but it's really an affront to women everywhere, to be frank with you. And it makes things deeply unsafe for women and for women who are survivors of sexual assault and rape, and it's horrific, and it actually really did translate into real world harm. I can go into more detail of the rape denial itself. I will say that 66% of the rape and sexual violence denial was in English, not in Arabic. And the explanations around the rape denial was there are no proof, witnesses are lying for profit. Muslims don't rape, or that actually Israel raped its own people. Okay, so this is the level of denial and dehumanization of very human victims of the horrific sexual violence and rape that happened on October 7th. And I do want to point out that one of the things that was very difficult for me at the time when I was bringing this to the attention of the social media platforms, which had an average rate of removal of only 9%, so far below average upon reporting, one of their misinformation and disinformation representatives said, well, this is rape denial after the fact of the attack, and I don't really see how it causes real world harm. And that was literally something that was said to me by a social media platform representative.
Was it a
And
man or
about
woman, by the way?
was a man, not
Mm.
surprising. And about 2 weeks later was the first incident of revenge rape against a woman who was kidnapped in France in her 30s and raped in revenge for what's happening in Israel. And that was followed about a month later by a 12-year-old girl in France again being gang raped by a bunch of 15-year-olds for being Jewish. So the real world harm of the denial narrative online is being felt very directly by the Jewish community and by women and girls everywhere.
And can we zoom a little bit out in the notion that what people are seeing online will impact their actions, whether it's a physical action or just something verbally or something that they repost?
Yeah, absolutely. So
Because
if you
that's
even
that's
look at
really key. That's really key behind all of this, really, is that what people are seeing, they're going to take action on.
what you believe will justify your actions. Susan Sarandon was famously stopped in the streets in New York at an anti-Israel demonstration and asked by a young lady, they raped people. Why are you here? Are you supporting that? And she said, that's propaganda. So if you think about the useful idiots concept, they genuinely believe this. This is the content that was reaching millions of people in the first 3 weeks to a month following the October 7th attacks. The social media platforms failed to respond to it effectively, even though there was a policy on the books that would justify it. Rates of removal very much below average. So it was platformed very quickly and it became widely held belief, and people are acting on their beliefs. It's a direct result what you're seeing online content and how that's informing people's actions. And I want to bring this to a second point. It's not only about the denial. What we saw in the weeks following October 7th was also a platforming or a romanticizing of pro-terror content. Okay, this is also about figures from Hamas, from Hezbollah, and doing things like the proliferation of the red triangle. The
Mhm.
red triangle, which is now a symbol where you can see at any anti-Israel demonstration, is a symbol for a target of Hamas. It is used in their propaganda videos. That upside down red triangle started propagating online first, and the social media platforms failed to remove that at scale. And most recently, that specific red triangle is now being spray painted in Washington, D.C., with the threat Hamas is coming. So the platforming and the normalization of terror symbols online is also translating into open threats for terrorism in the streets. It is a national security issue. It is not just an anti-Semitism issue.
I agree 100%. And we're going to continue this conversation, Tal-Or, in just a sec. But, when we talk about information sharing, there's no better place to be when it comes to information sharing about Israel than Jewish National Fund USA's Global Conference for Israel, which this year is taking place in Dallas, Texas. I know you're from Maryland. Have you been to Dallas, by the way?
Well, my Mexican husband's family now lives in Texas, and I was in Dallas once. Lovely
Okay.
place.
All right. Well, I can't wait to go because I've never been there except for the airport passing through once. But indeed, that Global Conference for Israel, Jewish National Fund USA's annual conference will be taking place November 14th to the 17th in Dallas, Texas. And it's filled with solidarity, inspiration, tactical and practical solutions. It's a little bit about what we're talking about here to standing up against Jew hatred and really in support of Israel. And it's really a wonderful venue to learn how to be a voice for Israel. And there are some absolutely stellar guests that are slated to speak, including our very own Colonel Richard Kemp, whom we've had here on the program, actor and comedian Michael Rappaport. I have a front row seat for Michael, so no one take my seat. Broadcaster and activist Emily Austin, founder of Makkah, Elizabeth Rand, Rabbi David Wolpe, and so many others will be taking the stage. And I would love to see each and every one of you within earshot at Jewish National Fund USA's Global Conference for Israel, once again, the 14th to the 17th of November 2024 in Dallas, Texas. And to learn more and to register, please go to jnf.org. Once again, jnf.org. And there's a link there that will take you there to register. And we'll hope to see everybody in Dallas, Texas. And we'll report back to you, Tal-Or, on how the conference went, because it's going to be just a really, really remarkable venue once again to share information about Israel and to come together in solidarity. So I'm very much looking forward to that. Now, as a lawyer, I want to ask you, because this whole conversation begs the question, the difference between free speech and hate speech. So I'm wondering if you can just share your thoughts on that.
Well, legally, I can tell you that the difference between free speech and hate speech is up to the country that you're in. The hate speech doctrine in the United States is radically different from the hate speech doctrine in Germany or in the UK. That's primarily due to the fact that those countries have actually lived through the power of hate speech when it's platformed and state-sponsored fascism, right? Okay. But let's look at this from a more tech perspective from the world that we live in, and people very much feeling like they are entitled to say whatever they want online. There is a difference between free speech and paid speech. Paid speech, these are private companies. Their business plan revolves around advertiser revenue. It is not correct to conflate free speech, which is your protection, your freedom to read, think, write, express yourself at no penalty from the government, versus express yourself on a private company's platform that is actually paid speech meant to be algorithmically charged. Put it another way, you may defend the rights of Nazis to march in Skokie, Illinois, because it's their constitutional right, but you probably wouldn't defend their right to go march through Disneyland. Why? Because it's a private property and it's a family place. Same thing with our mainstream social media platforms. These are private companies with algorithmically charged speech funded by advertiser funds that are reaching half of the worldwide population, including our youngest audiences and our children. It's not quite the same thing as saying I have the right to write a critical op-ed of my government. And I think that that's very important to think about. The content moderation policies, or the digital policies that these private companies have come up with, that's what they decide to enforce on their platforms. What Cyberwell is trying to do is make sure that that is equally enforced rules and effectively enforced rules to prevent the spread of digital Jew hatred.
Now, let's talk about which social media platforms you've been working with and any sort of impact that you've had with them, and also their level of receptiveness to taking on the information that you've shared with them, Tal-Or.
Right. So Cyberwell, since we launched in May of 2022, has become a trusted partner of Meta, covering Facebook, Instagram, and Threads, and of TikTok. We also share data with the other major platforms that we are monitoring directly, but those are the platforms that have programs for working directly with nonprofits to better inform and enforce their policies. So I can certainly say that there are good people at each of these platforms that are interested in enforcing their rules more effectively. And we can also see that in terms of the steps to better improve the way that social media is dealing with modern anti-Semitism today. I can point to the fact that Meta updated their policy recently to recognize that Zionist is actually a code word used to speak about Jews and Israelis online and to actually spread anti-Semitism. Cyberwell was a big part of that process by actually providing examples directly to Meta to inform how they would update these policies, and not only to inform how they would update the policies, but we still continue to give over examples to them so that that policy can be implemented, meaning we're training the classifiers inside of the platform itself to be able to identify when that word is being abused to spread anti-Semitism. Another piece of good news for everybody, this information came out on Rosh Hashanah, so probably nobody paid attention, but TikTok now also recognized that Zionist is a code word for speaking about Jews online. That means that modern forms of anti-Semitism under this proxy term Zionist are now going to be removed better at scale, and Cyberwell intends to be a big part of that. Another thing is we've talked today a lot about October 7th denial, and we successfully were working with TikTok. We brought them to be the first social media platform to recognize that October 7th denial is actually prohibited content under something called violent event denial. And since then, we've seen the rates of removal go up exponentially, not only at TikTok, but also at X. We also share data directly with X. X doesn't have an official program for working with nonprofits, but them and TikTok are the top two platforms who are now removing October 7th denial in a much more effective way.
So, if a news organization, say for example, like CBS, um, does a story about Gaza and about the deaths in Gaza, and it's not 100% right, and it tends to be a very one-sided report, how does that figure into all of this?
Fantastic question. So many people don't know that news sources on social media platforms are actually moderated much differently than a regular account. If you're a news source, including CBS, including Al Jazeera, you have license or more free reign to put information out there that wouldn't necessarily fly or be acceptable if you were on a regular account. This includes things like sharing Hamas footage if it's considered educational or newsworthy. There becomes an issue with that, and there's a general issue with the way that social media platforms deal with misinformation and disinformation. And the conflict right now that we've been having since October 7th really highlights that. So I'll give you an example. There was the infamous explosion of a rocket right outside of the Baptist hospital that happened early on in the conflict. That, because of social media, was blamed erroneously on Israel. Major news sources ran with that story, and actually Cyberwell tracked that piece of misinformation and disinformation, because it turned out that it was a misfire from a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket, triggered a trend in hashtag Hitler was right on Twitter. So the fact that our mainstream news sources are at a race to the bottom with misinformation and disinformation not only has a major effect in terms of the way that people are getting their information about the conflict, but it can even trigger trends in online anti-Semitism. The way that social media platforms deal with misinformation and disinformation is completely ineffective. Let me share with your audience, okay? They have something called third-party fact checkers. It means that if you're reporting something on social media as misinformation, disinformation, it's not even going to the platforms. It's going to a third-party fact checker who is manually checking that, and they get to select if they want to check your report or not, which means that when it comes to information dealing with the conflict or dealing with any conflict really, that's hard to verify, right? People don't have to even look into that. They're not going to check something, they're not going to fact check something that they don't know anything better about. So they will often ignore completely misinformation and disinformation reports coming out about Israel. That's exactly why we saw such a low rate of removal with October 7th denial content. And there's even evidence of deeply biased anti-Israel third-party fact checkers who are spending their resources essentially competing in a narrative war against true information coming out about Israel and their response during the conflict.
So these fact checkers are at the social media platforms, is what you're saying.
No, they're third party.
Who hires them? You mean the social
So
media platforms?
yes, they do. They're paid by the social media platforms. They're part of something called IFCN, if I'm not saying that incorrectly, which is a fact-checking network, international fact-checking network. But once you're part of the network, and even if you're being paid by the social media platforms as a third-party fact checker, there is no quality assurance on your work. There is no key performance indicator. You can check whatever misinformation or disinformation that is sent to you. And even if, and there were multiple instances post October 7th, a fact checker is actually checking facts wrong and has a deeply anti-Israel bias, there's nothing that the platforms do about it. Third-party fact checking system, no one's looking at their work, and we leave it as it is. But even if you think, Stephen, about the scale of what I'm talking about, right? Social media platforms have, on average, between major platforms, between 20,000 to 40,000 human content moderators. And in addition to that, they have this volunteer, semi-paid service of third-party fact checkers. When you have deep abuse of our mainstream social media platforms, campaigns that are meant to change the narrative, deny that this atrocity ever happened, that is simply not effective resources. And this brings us back to what we were talking about before. If we saw, and we did, see that social media platforms were hijacked on October 7th and in the weeks following and are still being abused today in campaign and narrative wars. What are we doing about that from a security perspective? Where is the minimum amount of investment? What are the takeaways? I think that this is something that is a deep concern, a national security concern for any Western democracy that's under the threat of a terrorist attack today.
Yeah, because if we divorce October 7th from the conversation, imagine how these social media platforms can be hijacked, and frankly, they are being hijacked with
Correct.
messaging that is just simply false, that's simply incorrect. And that's really a threat to democracy.
100%, and also deeply hostile against Jews, which
Yeah.
from a historical perspective gives us cause for concern. The shift in the anti-Semitic narrative being openly hostile, openly violent, and there just seems to be no brakes on this train. It's off the tracks.
Is there another solution, though, besides using those fact checkers?
It's a wonderful question. I think the rollout of AI technology actually is a glimmer of hope. The way that X and YouTube have been dealing with this is something through called community notes, but that has a number of issues as well because it's essentially crowdsourced fact checking. Instead of going to a third party fact checker, we're going to the most popular opinion and information that people are putting in there. If you ever want to see where that may run into a problem, look at any Wikipedia entry about Israel. You can see lots of bias issues there.
Yeah.
But the fact that we have AI now to collect information, do things like give us accuracy grades, may be a way to combat this issue. But I also think there are solutions that we should explore that are coming from the finance world. I mentioned that I'm a lawyer in recovery. One of my jobs was actually working on Wall Street. If you look at the stock markets, there are rules about how often you can trade a stock. Those rules and regulations by the SEC exist in order to prevent something called market manipulation or price manipulation. Well, why don't we have the same thing when it comes to content views and engagement, right? Why don't we start creating rules around how fast something can be introduced as viral? That is something that we can do to combat the manipulation of the false clicks of bots, etc. So I think we've only begun to scratch the surface on our solutions, but what's really important is that people need to prioritize this as an issue. The Jewish community is patient zero for the way that mass communication methods can be weaponized. So it's a direct interest of ours to be prioritizing this as an area that needs reform, it needs inquiry, and it needs new rules.
So just a couple other questions, Tal-Or. By the way, you've absolutely blown my mind with all of this, and this is really, it's quite scary. I don't even know if that's the right word, but it is. It's just
Okay.
really scary what is happening here. So what grade then, A to F, would you give social media platforms in combating Jew hatred, just generally, as well as particular social media handles?
I think I would give it a D for do better
Okay.
across the board, right? D for do better. I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater and say, well, they're complete failures.
And by the way, I
There
know that
are,
you have to work with them, so I don't know if you want
I,
to give them all an F.
I,
I mean, do you have frank conversations with them?
100%. And
And
I'll say it
and
again.
how often are you engaged with them?
As a trusted partner, we are in regular touch with Meta and with TikTok, which I have to say have been the most collaborative and dedicated platforms to dealing with the issue of online anti-Semitism. And there are resources that are being dedicated. There are teams that are being dedicated, but we all need to do better. And I simply can't put it any other way because, as I said, the Jewish community right now is directly under attack. And a major component of that is the online climate. Okay. So when you look at these social media platforms, very easy to say that they're just all so horrible. It's not true. We've managed to work with our partners to remove tens of thousands of pieces of content at scale, trends at scale, changes to policy. There is progress, but there needs to be something very significant in terms of the way that we look at the October 7th hijacking of our platforms. And now we're turning that into a systematic solution to deal with this online safety issue more effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I'm super mindful of our time, but there's something that I have to bring up again, and I can't get it out of my head is this notion of the legacy media, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, et cetera, that they essentially can have a biased reporter. And there are biased reporters, and we've seen them, and they can pretty much post on social media whatever they want, and it'll really just go through that because
Yeah, I
again
think
people will say well that's CBS, that's ABC, so therefore it must be correct, therefore it must be trusted.
yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're highlighting here is the lack of any kind of accountability for traditional media outlets, right? I've
Yeah.
been talking to you for a while about social media accountability and the reform that we can do and the technology we can invest in to get to more effective social media accountability. But the role that traditional media plays in the narrative wars around Israel and also in the way that the Jewish community is perceived, to be frank with you. There is no accountability for our traditional media sources. I want to share with you that one of the biggest failures here, in my mind, I'll never forget this. Israel departed from their typical policy of not sharing pictures of victims of terror and shared the picture of the two children who were burnt alive by Hamas and were literally infused together. And Al Jazeera Arabic, which is one of the most influential traditional media platforms out there, tweeted out that that was an AI generated image, which is a clear example of October 7th denial, which is deeply anti-Semitic and horrific, and frankly is amplifying misinformation and disinformation. And they were part of an entire network of accounts on Twitter that were doing this and platforming this level of conspiracy theory and denial for millions and millions of people, and directly informing the way that they would then react to the defensive war and to the Jewish community. It is unacceptable. And the fact that there's no accountability for the traditional media outlets, and I would say there is even less accountability for traditional media outlets on social media
That's where I was going with
than
that
in the
because a
real
lot of
world. Yes,
yeah, because a lot of people look at the traditional media on social media,
absolutely.
right?
We've reported multiple instances of Al Jazeera specifically taking Hamas propaganda from their Telegram channels content, videos, hostage videos, and just directly putting it right all over their social media. And my social media contacts have told me we're never going to close their account, even though it's in direct violation of their anti-terror policy, because they're considered newsworthy
There you
and
go.
educational.
Right.
Yep.
Well, listen, Tal-Or, as we wind down the conversation right now, what can the average person do? Someone like, say, for example, yours truly, that is constantly doom scrolling. Um, I mean, what can the average person really do as it relates to all of this hate, this anti-Semitic, this Jew hatred hate that is out there on social media?
So I'll say very openly that I actually don't recommend engaging with anti-Jewish content online in the sense of responding to it, but I do recommend reporting to it. You've already been affected by it. You already saw it. You should take the extra minute to go ahead and report that content online because
How do you
surveys
do
have
that?
shown. Oh, you can do it. I mean, I can definitely show you resources on Cyberwell side, but every time you're looking at a piece of content, there is a place to report it. Typically, it's identified or by the three dots on TikTok. It's identified by the share if you want to share the content, and there's a place to report that content. Why am I talking about reporting? It's surveys have shown that only 1 in 3 people who have experienced online anti-Semitism actually take the time to go ahead and report that content or report the comment. So if only 1 in 3 of us have taken the time to actually report it, it means that the issue is going severely underreported. And then if you get back an automated response that doesn't violate policy, at least on Meta and on TikTok, you have the ability to escalate that and appeal that process. When you appeal a report, let's say the algorithm tells you it doesn't violate our policy, and you go ahead and report it again, you're upping the chances that a human being will actually review that content. So I'm saying, you've seen the anti-Semitism online. You took a minute to be offended by it. Take an extra minute to go ahead and report that content. I'll also share that if you don't have that content removed today at Cyberwell's open platform, app.cyberwell.org, you can actually send that to us and we will roll that up into a compliance process, meaning the regular work that we're doing with the social media platforms. We will take that content and have that inform our next alert or report with them.
So again, folks can go to cyberwell.org.
App.cyberwell.org to report online anti-Semitism to us. If you want to see our research and reports, you can go to cyberwell.org.
Got it. App.cyberwell.org to report anti-Semitic behavior on social media. Got it. We're all going to take your advice. And then really one final thing, and this is sort of my asking Tal-Or versus Tal-Or who works for Cyberwell, although you can answer it either way, any way that you want. So assuming that some of these platforms are taken down or some of these people are called out or they're shut down in terms of their social media presence, they're still going to have this Jew hatred in them. And I'm just wondering, how do we really get to the root of it?
So there's the classic answer is education. I think unfortunately, let's just if we take a step back for a second, unfortunately, October 7th made it very clear to me as a Jew and as an Israeli what it means to be Jewish. We were living in a time period after the Holocaust where anti-Semitism was deeply unpopular. We enjoyed some kind of nice period of time where we thought that this was going to be normal. Actually, what we're experiencing now in the open hostility against Jews is historically normal. It's unfortunate to say that. And then the question is, what do you do in that situation? How do you find meaning? How do you find a way to be resilient as a Jewish person, as a proud Zionist in a moment where all of a sudden it's not popular to be Jewish, right? And resilience means different things to different people. But I think this is exactly why we need the state of Israel. We're now living in a world where we are not Jews with trembling knees, where we have a home, where we have a military. And I would encourage every single American citizen, European citizen who's a Jew to be uncompromising. Your government owes you protection. Be uncompromising in your fight against anti-Semitism. I think that that's a much more effective way of living your life authentically than cowering or trying to get rid of part of your identity. But I'm pretty gung ho. I moved here when I was 18. So that's that's my position on it. But I really think that strategically, when we look at fighting anti-Semitism, we have kind of, as a community, ignored the power of social media because it was tech-based, because it was new. Maybe we didn't understand it. But if you look at our history, we are patient zero for the way that effective channels of communication or mass communication can be used against our community. We are the number one targeted. We are patient zero. We have to understand that first, there are mass campaigns of communication against us, and only then can that result in system-wide violence against Jewish people. But be that the Catholic Church, be that the salons prior to the Third Reich, be that the mass communication media of radio and of print newspapers that were deeply anti-Semitic. That is the social media platforms right now, and you will not get a society to turn on its Jews before the concept of that conspiracy theory of hating Jews is normalized in mass media. So this is the most important front as far as I'm concerned. If we want to see systematic change against anti-Semitism, we need to create systematic solutions to get it out of our digital platforms.
And on that note, we're going to leave it right there. Tal-Or, Cohen, Montemayor, this has been so enlightening, and we truly want to thank you for joining us here on IsraelCast. We'd love to have you back to continue the conversation and to really see the development of Cyberwell's work moving forward and really what you're doing, and really just congratulations to you and the team. So thanks once again for joining us.
Thank you, Stephen. Great to be here.
All right, and we'll have info about Tal-Or and Cyberwell on the show notes page of our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast. And as I always say, we do release new episodes of the show every other Wednesday. I don't know why you'd want to miss an episode. And just so you never miss an episode, indeed, subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Simply search for IsraelCast. And don't forget to rate and review us, because that really helps with our rankings, which in turn make it easier for more folks around the world to find us. Or you can always enjoy the show by visiting us at our website. Once again, it's jnf.org/IsraelCast. Now, it takes a whole moshav to put IsraelCast together. For that, we thank Vivian Grossman, Stefan Oberman, J.D. Krebs, and Ellie Kadrin. Our editors are Jay Rothman and James Casada from Miratone Studios right here in the very heart of New York City. And the music that you hear at the top until the program is titled My Eden. It's by the very talented Rafi Malkiel from his album Water on the Tzaddik label. IsraelCast is powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. And for more info about JNF USA, do visit jnf.org. And if you'd like to write to us with story ideas or just to say hello, I know Tal-Or would love to hear from you, and so would I. So do email us at israelcast@jnf.org. Meantime, I'm Stephen Shalowitz. Thank you for tuning in and looking forward to having you join us on future episodes of IsraelCast.